Rock and roll music is so goddamn important. It really is. And the way you would look at that, you're in the middle of it now, so you can't see it. But if you look back in 100 years ago, 150 years ago, during the period of classical music and romantic music, Baroque music, these were all in conjunction with graphic arts. And the same thing is happening now. We're in the age of rock and roll. And the art that I do and these other guys do is rock and roll art. Hand in hand. And you can't see this now. In 100 years from now, you'll look back and you'll see that this is the age of rock and roll, and this is the stimulated visuals of this period of time.
A few years back, I was in a bookstore and I came across a book called The Art of Modern Rock. I remember being totally blown away. I was working a cushy corporate television job at the time, and I was just about as burned out as I could get. I started getting more and more into the poster movement, and soon I discovered this website called gigposters.com, where close to 20,000 artists were doing and posting rock poster art on their own without the help of corporate money. It was then that I realized that it's actually this huge art movement going on right now in America. So, shortly after, I decided to quit my job and travel across the country interviewing rock poster artists from the different decades to find out how our modern-day movement got so big. I tried for months to get funding for the film, but with no luck. So, at times it was a bit challenging, but somehow it got done. So this is where the story begins. It's the story of how the American rock poster movement was born and how it grew to what we know it as today.
Again.
Have some string and you let me now. My socks are loose, my socks are loose. There's nothing else that I'd rather do today. Oh, them facts, them good. Don't make them stand up on my leg just like a good sock should now. Sock slides down my leg, winds up deep inside my shoe. Get on me.
I came home from work one day, and I remember coming home, turning on the TV, and on the TV, an Army commercial came on, and it was like, you know, that typical Army commercial, you know, that real triumphant music and the guys, you know, learning how to operate machines. And the narrator said, "You've read the stories of other people's lives. Now start writing your own." Right, and it was talking about the Army, But it hit me in a totally different way. I'm like, yeah, I gotta start writing my own story, right? So like about a week later, I quit. It was hard. I mean, I remember I would eat one time a day, you know, and I would do posters in exchange for food vouchers at some of the venues. It was sacrifice, but you know, I don't really see it that way unless I'm like in a setting like this, sit down and think about it. You know, it's kind of like you just doing what you had to do and you were happy.
I got my start doing posters kind of by accident. I'd always been into posters, and like growing up, like as a teenager, I always had really cool rock posters around my room. And I knew I wanted to be an illustrator and an artist, and I've played music since I was 15, and so by default, I was the one asked to start making the flyers and stuff. In the beginning, when I started doing posters, I'd bring the posters to the show and I'd ask the band, like, hey, is it cool if I sell my posters? And I'll give you a stack and you can sell them later on. Then, you know, you get to see their excitement, like, oh, rad. I think, you know, 99.9% of the time, the bands are just so amped about it.
Jay and I met in the 90s in the indie rock touring circuit of small bands that very few people care about playing together.
My favorite posters are usually the ones that I get to make for my favorite bands. It's more satisfying to have like an emotional investment in what you're doing. Either I listen to them all the time or they're good friends of mine and I can't wait to see what's Jason gonna think about this. This is gonna be funny.
My first poster was actually a flyer. It was for Nirvana, of course, unsanctioned whatsoever. It was just something I was doing just for the hell of it. I was going to the show and I was really excited about it. I did up this little flyer and I put them up around town, and it was just kind of fun. It was kind of like a little tee-hee-hee, because, you know, I didn't even tell anyone it was me, and, you know, I just did it and it was fun. So I was like, wow, that was cool, you know. I was hooked, yeah.
I let it out, I gotta scream and shout. I let it out, I gotta get it out. I let it out, I gotta scream and shout. I know just what I'm talking about. Back in the day, I was...
For the most part, the bands just want something cool that will appeal to the fans. And that leaves you with a lot of room to maneuver, as opposed to working with other types of advertising where it's very specific. So if you have something unique and something to express, then I think posters are a really interesting little subculture.
The interesting thing about the history of rock posters is we tend to think of rock posters as these glorious full-color things that support an actual event, but that kind of came out of the folk scene. You know, prior to that, what you had were like boxing posters. They were also printed to support drag races and rodeos, horse races, wrestling, boxing, and that's what rock and roll postering emerged from.
Before rock took off in the late 50s, there were several places in America doing poster printing. One of them was a place called Hatch Show Print. Hatch started back in the 1800s by doing handbills and various advertisements for events of the time. They're still around today, doing, among other things, some of the coolest rock posters for the bands of today.
Hatch Show Print was founded in 1879, and the beautiful part about being this old is we haven't changed our technologies. The copper Hank Williams plate sleeps gently against Louis Armstrong's, I think, is a fantastic gesture towards our responsibility as preservationists here.
Letterpress is a great American tradition in terms of postering. A lot of the early wanted posters, like you see in the cowboy movies, are done by letterpress. So this is a special process, and people have a personal connection with letterpress.
For folks who are unfamiliar with letterpress, it's the simplest of processes. You have a type, it could be an image, it could be a linoleum block. Ink is applied to that surface. It's rolled through a press, and the paper is pressed onto that surface with ink in between, hence the word letterpress. So the letters are literally pressed into the paper.
We have an ice cream cone, clown, and most recent block, Huey, the cat, carved by me. We're making postcards. Huey will be on front somehow. Not sure how I want to represent Huey yet.
Well, the way I got involved in it was in the mid to late 80s in college. I was a graphic design student and really hated the Macintosh computer. And I didn't want to be in a cubicle doing brochures for a hospital. So we had an old Vandercook that was sitting over there, in the corner, never been used in years. And there was a little box of type under the sink. So I got in there and started playing with it.
We kind of got the phone book out and started calling just some local print shops here in town, and we found people that had letterpress and printing equipment, and the letterpress would be scattered everywhere, so we'd have to go dig it out piece by piece, and have our arms would just be black. We would just be black from head to toe.
We always wanted to make a poster that was more of a merchandise thing and reintroduce the poster as a viable thing that bands could sell as merchandise, just like t-shirts and the whole deal. So we were always trying to make it something more precious than just a piece of paper. Getting a letterpress shop together, very difficult. Couldn't be done today because we were able to get this stuff 10 and 12 years ago. There was no demand for it. It was languishing, laying around. But the good stuff, it is so rare and collectible now that, fonts go for over $1,000 a piece for a little font. We probably have over $1 million worth of movable typography in here. Unreal that we built this shop. And if you meet somebody who's been doing it for 10 years, you got to buy them a beer,
When I was at school, it was those purple and orange Jimi Hendrix posters. I used to get very confused because I didn't know whether I played the guitar left-handed or right-handed. And I'd buy posters of Jimi Hendrix. Sometimes it was this way round. Sometimes it was this way round because they'd reverse the photograph,
The rock concert, as we know it today, for the most part started in San Francisco. It's where the world got its first glimpse of the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Hendrix, and the list goes on. And with the rise of this new music form came a need for advertising, since this music was still not played on the radio. At the time, America was coming out of a repressive 50s mindset, and the bands and the artists who did their posters represented sort of a rebellion against conformity, and in many cases, silent protest against a war many at the time didn't believe in.
The 50s were an extraordinary time of conformity, of suburbia, boredom. It sounds stupid, but nobody had long hair. You couldn't have long hair, You couldn't wear a certain kind of clothing. You had to be like everybody else. And the children of the 50s became the screaming hippies of the 60s.
If you had a peace sign or a dove on a bumper sticker on your car and a long hair, you were getting stopped. Trust me. A simple little icon like the dove meant you were a dove and not a hawk. It was very inflammatory times. If you take into context the events of '69, the Vietnam War being a pervasive event in the lives of all of the people who were 18, 19, 20 years old, these bands represented those who sat on one side of the fence. It was as much about that as it was about the music.
The musicians were everything back then, and the reason they were everything is that once you joined, quote, the counterculture, you did stop watching television, and you did stop reading the straight newspapers, because they were lying. They were all telling you stories that you didn't want to hear. In order to join together with the members of your fellow tribe, you had to go to the ballroom.
Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, there was always 3 bands or 4 bands playing, and everybody would be dancing.
On Friday, I'd go either to the Avalon or the Fillmore, and then Saturday I'd go to the other one, and then Sunday, if I liked one really a lot, I'd go back on Sunday. So I'd spend the whole weekend at the concert.
66 would have been when I first went to the Fillmore and Avalon ballrooms. I mean, it was a wonderful place. It was very low-key, and it was a small venue compared to what people know of today. And the sound was wonderful in there. The lighting was wonderful. The bands were wonderful. Can I say it on tape? The dope was great.
There's a theory in both psychedelic art and punk art, and that is, if you can't read it, or if it offends you, maybe you're not supposed to go. If you can't read the words Big Brother and the Holding Company on a Matrix poster, okay, then maybe it's not for you.
It was a game. Can you read this? See, we were talking to our friends. When I would go to the Family Dog dances or the Bill Graham dances, I knew half the people there. These were the artists, the poets, the fringes of society that were creating this new culture.
The lettering that was
You had to sit and puzzle over it. If you were stoned, you could read it, live on Friday at the Fillmore West. But if you were too square, you couldn't see it. It's kind of a Rorschach blot for hipness.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
The Fillmore Auditorium is one of the few dance halls that was around in the 60s in San Francisco that still puts on shows today. If you go upstairs, you can see a huge collection of posters that were done for the venue. Posters done for, in many cases, the love of the scene and not so much the small paycheck the artist got for doing them. Most of the Fillmore's success was due to a man named Bill Graham, who had moved to San Francisco after escaping Nazi Germany as a child.
Bill Graham really invented the rock concert, and with Chet Helms and the Family Dog, the two of them were the innovators in putting on these shows, introducing Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin to the world.
There were no rules on how to run concerts or how to perform at concerts, and there were the light shows, and some of the musicians would have their backs to the audience for half the show and be watching the light show. And people started going to concerts to discuss the wares of the day. It was escapism, but it was an attempt to express a hope for a better society. The most extraordinary expression of human behavior that I've ever seen. We'll never see that again on that level. The adventurous aspect of the society of that time is extraordinary.
At the time, poster art resonated with the public, and it developed a sense of camaraderie between the band, the promoter, and the audience, so that you could reasonably expect that any night at the Fillmore, it's going to be entertaining, perplexing. You could get really, really high. You probably meet some neat chicks or guys. It was a scene. He was promoting a scene.
Bill Graham started giving them away at the end of the shows to get people out. The first 500 people out the door got a free poster, and it was to clear the music hall.
There was an old black woman in there named Peaches that checked your coat, and she would give you the poster. And when you could only get it when you were leaving after the show, and you got one poster for the next week's show. And that was the first printing poster. And they're incredibly valuable today. Now, Bill Graham would kill me and Peaches if he knew this, but I got to be friends with her, and she used to rat hole them for me. And so if I didn't go for a few weeks, I could go and Peaches would say, "Now, honey, don't you tell Bill, but here's your posters,
Well, not only did you get a free poster on your way out, but you could go to like the psychedelic shop or any record store in the Bay Area, and they'd have a stack of them like that on the counter, and just take half of them, and nobody cared.
We had a show in '67. A big gallery asked us to do a show, and it was called The Joint Show. They chose 5 of the artists, and we got labeled the Big Five then.
There's a kind of a myth, I feel, of something called the Big Five that came about from The Joint Show, which is Rick Griffin, Mouse, Kelly, Wilson, and Victor Moscoso. And I'm not saying that these are not all extremely important artists on the scene. It's just that there were many important artists on the scene.
Their work did define a certain era, and Time magazine would call it the hippie era, but it was like the late 60s, long before it caught on as a national fad, as then you'd see it in like Kleenex ads and things,
You get on the bus there, this is '66 when the Fillmore and Avalon were first starting. They put the posters for the shows that Wes Wilson designed in the buses, right on the place where the driver is, and they had like a poster board. So you get on the bus and you'd see, the Mind Benders at the Fillmore, what's that all about?
If you look at that whole era and the whole feel, the clothing, the music, the art that was coming out of there, his stuff is real flowing. And I think that's why they say he's the grandfather.
When I first saw his posters, when I first came to San Francisco, I would see these really powerful posters with this really far out typography that I've never seen before ever. Wes really inspired me. Matter of fact, I still try to do posters like that, and I still haven't been able to pull it off.
One of the most revered rock poster artists of the 60s is a guy named Stanley Mass. Stanley was from Detroit, and he was influenced by the car culture there. By high school, he had become somewhat of a local celebrity by doing airbrush t-shirts at the state fair. Stanley later became known as the guy responsible for designing the Grateful Dead logo, with the skeleton and roses. Between him and his late partner Alton Kelly, it's been said that they quote-unquote painted the face on rock and roll.
When I moved to San Francisco, a lot of my friends were moving out there, and I heard there was a lot of good things happening. Actually, it was funny. In Detroit, you could get drive-away cars because they build them there and they want to send them out to the different states. And I called the drive-away place, and they said all they had was a hearse. And so I said, perfect. And they said, perfect? So I put a Make Love, Not War sticker on the back and put in the dog and my girlfriend and all my art stuff and headed to San Francisco.
Stanley Mouse especially was a great influence on me even before I had gone to San Francisco. The feeling you get from a Mouse poster is just great. Well, it's an atmosphere. The picture that he'd use and the colors, it's that indefinable something that's just, you look at it and wow, yeah.
The first poster I did with Kelly was for the Grateful Dead, and it was a picture of Frankenstein, and we misspelled grateful. It's funny, Kelly's not a good speller, I'm a good speller, but it still got by both of us. But we spelled it G-R-E-A-T. Oh, after it got printed, we suffered tremendously. But in a way, it was good that it said great. Well, because they were great. I really liked working with Kelly because he had a great layout sense, and because I was airbrushing t-shirts for 8 years, my hand was rock solid, and he was great with layout and interesting ideas, and he was left-handed and I was right-handed, so we could actually sit at our later big extravagant airbrush pieces for the Grateful Dead, and we'd sit there and we could work out the same board at the same time, like a four-handed monster. We had a job doing a poster for the Grateful Dead, and we kept saying, well, we gotta find something. So we were in the library in the back room where you couldn't check out books, but they had a really rich collection of old poster books and stuff. And in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, we found this picture of skeleton and roses. And we both looked at it and went, that says Grateful Dead all over it. Then the poster came out, and then the Dead used it for their logo.
Of the so-called Big Five poster artists from the 60s, 3 are alive today. Rick Griffin sadly isn't, but of all the artists working at that time, his work is still most closely associated with the music scene from that era. Rick was a surfer, and even before he did rock poster art, he had a large following from a cartoon character that he created for Surfer magazine called Murphy. Rick allegedly came to San Francisco from Southern California after seeing the posters done by Mouse and Wes Wilson. And when he arrived, his art instantly connected with the people in the scene. Many people today look back at that era and visualize Rick Griffin's crazy lettering and intricate drawings when they think of the 60s.
A lot of people who look at 60s posters or come at it from outside of the poster scene, when they talk about a look that they associate with posters, they're usually talking about a Rick Griffin poster. You know, that stuff with the really kind of drippy lettering and you can't read it, and eyeballs, and whatever they're mentioning is probably from a Rick Griffin poster.
And the person from that era that really blew me away and still blows me away is Rick Griffin. I mean, I loved his work. That really over-elaborate style of his, and I mean the way he would combine really intricate psychedelic typography with really cartoony, weird graphics. I would say that's the major influence.
There are a lot of modern poster artists who really love and respect Rick Griffin. I think it would be very interesting to ask every single artist you talk to, who is the most influential artist in terms of posters?
Well, artists that inspired me, Rick Griffin.
Griffin.
Well, Rick Griffin is
Griffin.
Rick Griffin.
Definitely Rick Griffin.
I consider him the Michelangelo of poster artists. His pen and ink work is fabulous. I don't think there was anybody better.
I was thrown out of art school because they told me that I had to stop cartooning, and I refused to stop, so they threw me out. So then after that, I went to San Francisco to collect psychedelic posters. And lo and behold, I wound up doing them. When I was 10 years old, I told my dad I wanted to buy a comic book, He took me to the dime store and gave me 10 cents for going to buy a comic. And I went in there and I looked over all the selections of comics, and I found this one comic, Mad Comics. And I was very impressed. So I bought this comic and I came back out and I showed my dad, and I was really excited. Dad, look at this comic I got. He looked through it and he said, I don't think so, son. Why don't you take this one back and get a Superman or a Mickey Mouse? You know, a real funny book. I did what I had to do, but I said from that day forward, I too will be an underground cartoonist.
One of the main reasons that Rick Griffin's work resonated with so many people is that Rick stepped outside of everyday experience. He did things on a two-dimensional surface that do not belong on a piece of paper. You can see him channeling, you know, cosmic forces, God, Jesus, whatever it was, psychedelics, through some unknown entity coming out of his pen and going onto the paper.
Probably the most famous example of psychedelic art is the famous eyeball image that Rick did for Jimi Hendrix. The eyeball is one of the few images I know that transcends from 60s hippies to hardcore punkers.
I think we all ripped off the flying eyeball at some part in our career. It's just a classic symbol of just rebellion or against the norm.
While I was in San Francisco, I stopped at a place called Wolfgang's Vault, which is home to the world's largest collection of 60s rock posters. It's a mind-blowing experience for anyone who's into this stuff. Most of the posters there are now worth far more than any of the artists at the time got paid to do them.
We have a lot of people who call us and want us to authenticate their posters. We keep these binders intact.
These are basically years of going over and figuring out first printing, second printing, third printing. So here's this flying eyeball in the binders. Sometimes it's a smudge, sometimes it's a mark, and they come out on every single poster, and that will delineate what's real, what's fake, what's first, what's second.
The name Wolfgang's Vault came from Bill Graham's birth name. Bill was born Wolfgang Grzanka and changed it when he came to the States. After Bill Graham died, we bought the assets. The entire archive was in a warehouse, and they were stacked and kept well, but more by coincidence than anything else.
He has a first printing in very nice condition, one of the hardest posters to find in good condition. He's got first printing without the blue. He has an off print where, you know, the colors just didn't match up quite right. He's got different shades with missing colors, and then he goes to the second printing. He's got one of those. He's got another second printing. He's got a bootleg copy in here just to show how to differentiate that between a second printing. It's an art. Poster printing is an art.
Out of all the artists in the 60s, I think Moscoso was probably my favorite just because of the psychedelic colors and the use of color, and you could kind of trip out and not even be on drugs.
I used to look at his work. I think the first time I saw it, I was on LSD, at some little zany comic that they had in the 60s and 70s, and just thinking, then later on, seeing it when I was completely square and straight, and realizing, no, I wasn't imagining that. This really is the way it looks, and he really was evoking this other state of mind that is not in the square world.
I started out trying to be into museums and stuff like that, valuable to the rich. Forget it, didn't happen. When I dropped out of that and went into popular art to make a living, the Museum of Modern Art in New York came knocking on my door. How about that? My schooling got in my way. I had learned that a poster should transmit its message quickly and simply. I had learned that lettering should always be legible. I had learned not to use vibrating colors because they're irritating to the eyes. I had learned all the wrong lessons for doing these kinds of posters. So what I did is I turned them upside down. so that lettering became as illegible as possible. A poster should not transmit its message quickly and simply. It should take as long as possible. Use vibrating colors wherever and whenever you can, and irritate the eye as much as possible. That's how you get attention. People from across the street would see this thing pulsing and cross the street. My intention was to grab people from across the street and make them come over to wherever the poster was and look at it. Not only look at it, but try to figure out what it said.
Victor was a highly cerebral artist. He could take red, blue, and green, and then when you shine red, blue, and green lights on it, flashing, the thing would move.
When the red gel comes over this image, you don't see the red. You only see the blue, and the blue tends to get dark. It reads as a relative black. When the blue gel comes over it, you don't see the blue. You only see the red, which becomes a relative black. A friend of mine had a hallway that was covered with posters and lit with Christmas tree lights, blinking Christmas tree lights. He comes to me and he says, "Hey, Victor, that poster that you did for the Doors, the lady flies." I said, "Really?" The moment he said it, I knew what I had done. I went home, I made a light box. Sure enough, she flew. It was only an accident once. The second time, it's a design.
Most people don't think of Detroit when they think of 60s rock. But the truth is, many of the bands coming out at that time also went to Detroit after hitting the West Coast. The city has always been a hotbed for music, dating back to the famous Motown era. And it's home to several ballrooms, one of which is called the Grandy Ballroom. The Grandy was the center of Detroit's psychedelic scene, and many of its posters were done by an artist in the scene named Gary Grimshaw.
One thing that does get overlooked that people don't understand about Detroit is that the automobile industry didn't make Detroit. Detroit made the automobile industry. This is a big place for stove manufacturing and the proximity to raw materials in the Great Lakes and the steel mills, but most importantly, the skilled labor and the craftsmen who were here. So there's this long history of craftsmanship, and a lot of that plays into the art that you see in Detroit. My first job actually was the first Grandy Ballroom poster. My best friend was Rob Tyner. He was the lead singer of the MC5, and Russ Gibb, who started the Grandy Ballroom, hired the MC5 to be the opening act for the ballroom. And it was all ages, there was no alcohol. Most of the people that went there were high school kids.
When I was in high school, every week they'd put out the Grandy Ballroom flyers and handbills, and I'd always get them, and in my classes when I should have been studying, I was drawing my own handbills for these shows, kind of based on Gary's style.
The posters reinforced visually the scene that was going on in the ballroom. If the Grandy Ballroom hadn't done any posters and just put on the shows, it would be really hard to go back and figure out what the hell happened there. But since there was a card or a flyer or something done for every show, you can reconstruct the whole history of it.
The cultural explosion that happened in America in the 60s only lasted for a few years. It was a time when artists were doing what they did for the love of it, creating scenes based on what they believed in. The scene soon saw its end, and with it died the rock poster art, for a while at least.
The scene was like really beautiful, and it was raging on, and we were having these great dance hall concerts, and everybody was dancing every night, and the media picked up on it. And all of a sudden we had our pictures in Life magazine and Look magazine, and here was a San Francisco scene, everywhere. And so all the crazies came from everywhere. And what happened was it was all these destitute kids coming to San Francisco with no money and nowhere to live, and they're just on the street begging, and the heroin moved in, and the scene got dark, and then Martin Luther King got shot, and there was racial strife. Haight Street got dangerous to be on. Bobby Kennedy got killed, and it just got bad. And it dissolved. Like my son always said to me, he said, why in the 60s did you just have parties? And why didn't you go blow up some buildings like the Weathermen? I thought about it for a long time, and I said, well, because having parties countered the bad stuff that was going on. We were having good stuff going on. We were having art and poetry and music and showing the world what life should really be like. Not war and oppression and greed and misery, but it should be joyous.
When I lose the point of reference, there's no good or bad, it's all okay. A faded blueprint, a little magic that I saved from younger days. It's not enough to find me, convince me why I should join your side. Prescribed convictions keep us dilated and fixed to conquer and divide. Inclined to pass the time alone, I get so drained talking about what's going on.
I was talking with Giesler, I can't remember her first name right now, who owned Poster Mat out of New York City. It helped Ben get started out here actually in San Francisco. And because she bought a lot of posters back then, she said the poster market collapsed. And I believe it was 1971. She sent back tons and tons of unsold posters that she had. As rock got larger, as bands could play one night in a large venue, make more money they could than playing 4 nights at the Fillmore, the economics became different.
What was going on in rock was this cock rock, arena rock, stadium rock, guys playing double-neck guitars, wearing spandex, and when they came to town they would have a whole slew of semi-trucks driving in with all their lights and all their equipment, and it just seemed like it wasn't something anyone we knew could do or would want to do. So when we started punk, it was us doing it for ourselves.
The rock bands became these giant, enormous, operatic, stadium-sized events. It was like you'd have to have a spaceship to be a musician instead of having a bicycle. And a lot of people thought, to hell with this, we want to get back to where you can just have a bicycle.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Well, the media was so ridiculous. It had left everyone behind.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon. Those charges are utterly false, utterly false, utterly false.
The media for the first time was being completely invaded by the Reagan right wing. And so any statements that didn't follow that line didn't have a place at all to be expressed.
Some of my favorite rock art came out in the 80s. Pretty much everything coming out at that time was flyer art, and almost nothing was in color. But it still represented the music scene at that time, in a way that I think even photographs don't capture. The flyers were the voice of an emerging punk population, dissatisfied with the government, big business, and of course, the corporate co-opting of music itself.
We were all fascinated with corporate rule and manipulation and how to counter that. And so what a lot of the early flyer art was anti-advertising, or putting the ad man's talent towards advertising rebellion and insurrection instead.
I think a lot of what happened with punk rock in the 70s was, outside of New York and LA, you had these isolated places like Akron or Cleveland, where there were these weirdos in a vacuum, and they were just sort of doing things that were interesting to them, and their only influences were maybe like some Captain Beefheart records or something. So they created really interesting, cool stuff because of that.
In the beginning, it was like the Dadaist movement of the beginning of the century, before the First World War. Theater, music, poetry, all at once. It wasn't just music, it was art. And sometimes there were flyers for things that, they weren't bands, they weren't events, they weren't anything. They were just weird Dadaist type, and some of them were really cool, and then some of them were real lame. I thought, boy, I could probably do at least as bad.
People came and they were like, I could have written that song, you know. I could play the bass that well. I mean, they're only playing 2 notes, you know. It was just, people really felt like it belonged to us.
Everybody I knew was like just doing all this stuff. People were like making music and doing art and like wearing crazy outfits. It was awesome. It was like every day was like an adventure. Like you would get up like, oh, what cool thing will happen today? It really changed my life because for the first time, I'm not gonna say that I fit in, but like everybody else was just as like not fitting in as me. So together, like, we actually had like a community. This all sounds really corny, but we felt like we had a purpose. We felt like we were changing things. We felt like that there was this like weird, crazy future ahead of us.
The flyers of the 80s were kind of like the posters of the 60s, done by people in the scene for very little money, and they both essentially served as an invitation for like-minded people to gather for an event. I guess you could say that in this pre-internet era, the flyers were, for lack of a better comparison, the MySpace of the 80s.
I was interested in punk rock, and I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there was just not a lot of punk rock to be found. There were really only 2 ways to get a record. Either a band came through town and they were selling records out of the back of their van, or you read about something to Maximum Rock and Roll, and you sent an envelope with a money order to somewhere, and maybe 2 months later you got a record back. I was talking to a younger guy, somebody in their 20s, about punk rock, and I basically told that same story, and he completely with a straight face said, well, why didn't you look for it on the internet?
Well, one thing was no computers and no, often people didn't have telephones if you didn't already have it. You know, if you rent an apartment, it's in someone's name and it's not available for you.
You know, we were super broke. We were living on top ramen at the time. We didn't have any money. We all lived in the same apartment.
The thing was, you could go to Kinko's or whatever and print up flyers for nothing. I mean, you know, it was like a couple of bucks. You could run off a few hundred flyers, and then you would like either make found art out of stuff you clipped out of magazines or photocopy stuff and glue it all together and then take it to the copy store and run off 50 copies.
My first flyer was, oh, let me run out to the convenience store and bought a handful of Bazooka Joe bubble gum and cut it up and taped it all together and went to the Xerox machine and blowed stuff up, moved stuff around, and that was my first flyer. You know, your most pure punk rock flyer on the planet, I guess.
Kinko's used to be real easy to rip off because you could just go in there and make 500 copies and be like, oh, I made 6. I mean, don't put that there, because I'll probably get arrested. Sorry, Kinko's.
They could declare me on their taxes as a dependent, you know. I've given them so much money, you know, in dimes, you know, at libraries over the years.
You would go in, make friends with the guy, and then you would dominate one of the machines that had really good blacks. And you would just camp there for hours making a zine or making a flyer, doing your paste up, and people would be coming up and going, I've got to make this Lost Dog flyer, and you're like, over there.
Over there. See the shitty one that you do by hand? It's the mimeograph machine. It works great.
I'd go to my library and I learned how to use the Xerox machine, and then started doing all kinds of crazy stuff because the librarians used to always get mad at first, and then they were like, oh yeah, he's the crazy skater kid making his little magazine, and you know, learning all the tricks. You could yank Xerox paper out while it was coming out, and you could stretch images, and you could move images on the glass and it would distort them.
Now here's one of the ones where Trey used to make each sign separately by putting his face on the Xerox machine, but here his eyes are closed, and I'm pretty sure I have one with them open.
I used to know all the Xerox machines in every library in the county and which ones had really good grain, which ones were kind of medium tones. And I'd literally take Xerox at one place and take it over to the other and Xerox it so I could get the exact pattern I want by driving miles around town.
There was a brief moment where there was this Dupli-Quick copy place by where I lived, and they had one Xerox machine that would only print blue ink and one Xerox machine that printed red ink and one that printed black ink. So I would do a drawing, run it through the blue, run it through the red, and run it through the black, and try to get a few colors. But you had to, make sure the paper was run through exactly precise, and it never was.
This is Marcus Leatherdale's skull. His dad was a veterinarian, and he had an X-ray machine, and Marcus stuck his head under there. I'm sure that's not very good.
Some of those images are just, they almost represent the band more than old tapes because they're funny and they just have this certain mythology wrapped up into, there's a certain mentality that you can tell about the band by why they would choose to put this weird stuff on their poster.
These things were so shocking back then that people would literally attack them. I saw this punk kid walking down the street and he was stapling up posters, and I was working a job where I kind of overlooked the University Ave in Seattle, which were one of the punk areas. And he'd walk down, it was a pink flyer, and he stapled it up with an impact stapler, went to the next one and did another, and he just worked his way down the street, and then, I wonder what that is, and then I saw this crowd of angry people walk about 2 or 3 minutes later, and they go to each poster and somebody would grab it and rip it down and shred it up and throw it in the air, and they'd be applaud, and they go to the next one. And they, it's like this mob following the guy down the street. And it was for a poster for a band called the Dead Kennedys, which at the time was so offensive that it incited violence in viewers.
This was a case where Klaus Fluoride actually made the poster for the show, and this photo had been on his bedroom wall, and I saw it and burst out laughing, and he said he had found it at a garage sale. Imagine our surprise when these people resurfaced and sued us for slander. And the only reason they were so angry was a sports writer was assigned to review Dead Kennedys album and knew so little about Dead Kennedys. This picture was printed and identified as Dead Kennedys in a Southern California daily newspaper. And the woman who was saying that she was really upset because she didn't want anybody to know she'd ever had hair like that.
We would go crazy with telephone poles, stapling it up, and we'd have to staple all around the edge because people would peel them off, and it would just make it so that they would just give up.
We would go out at night and wheat paste stuff, which was a mess. I had a briefcase filled with pots of wheat paste.
You go out in the middle of the night because you don't want to get caught by the cops, and you paste over the wall, stick your flyer up, and then sometimes you paste over it a second time. And if it actually dries before someone comes and takes it down, or if it doesn't rain that night, then your poster will be up there for a long, long time.
It got so bad in Seattle with the telephone pole postering that you had layers and layers and layers of staples and thumbtacks and nails and posters, and then it would rain. And then it would turn to paper mache, and it formed these blobs. It was they're almost like human figures instead of telephone poles. And it was kind of this white, gray, textured, and it's I remember they cut those poles in half and brought them into court, and they showed a cross section, and it was the most amazing. It looked like a fried egg, and the yolk would be the telephone pole, and then this big area that was this big white irregular blob was layers and layers and layers of poster paper mache. Finally, what happened was that, periodically they tried to get telephone pole posters banned because, one, that they were scary. Two is they were messy, and Seattle's a very tidy town. And thirdly, local business owners got pissed off because they had free advertising on telephone poles, and that ain't right because America hates people who get things for free.
In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the first person they threw the book at to make an example out of them for unauthorized postering was a woman who put up a flyer advertising an anti-war protest. And then once they fined her $200 plus a piece for the flyers they tore down, then they really went after the subversives, people who'd lost their pets.
The moment America started banning the hanging of flyers was the beginning of the end for the 80s flyer movement. The 80s were coming to an end, and cities all over the US began to see less and less Xerox art on the telephone poles. One of the biggest shifts in rock poster art started happening in the early 90s. American music was shifting from what was once called punk to what was now being labeled grunge. And in the center of Seattle, the so-called birthplace of grunge, was a man named Art Chantry.
This is probably worth, $300-400.
Art's fingerprint was on just about every grunge band flyer, record album cover, and publication that was coming out at that time. And his quirkiness and incredible sense of irony seemed to resonate with the kids of that era.
He was the master of that, the Xerox, and on a budget, a very small budget, getting something fabulous out of it.
Art Chantry's cut and paste aspect.
Taking the old and found things, reworking and making something new, and it's kind of what we do.
I was a fan of Art's work before I knew who the artist was. At first glance, you weren't sure what you were looking at. It looked like several different layers of old posters that had been on a wall for a long time, that part of one had started to come off and something else was pasted over it, and it just had this brand new but old aesthetic. And it was something that maybe anyone could do, like people think they could do, but it was definitely something that was more cerebral.
By the way, those little things that hold the CD in there, that's actually called a nibble in the tray. Here, I better get that off the screen or something. Oh, I'm sorry.
Saucy. Art Chantry's work is saucy. It's a little out of control. It's cut and paste. It's in your face. It's screw you. It also is, oddly enough, Americana, because he's using, for the most part, newspaper advertisements, magazine advertisements, and cutting them up and basically making you look at them under a different light.
This is actually for a seasoned performance artists at COCA, the Center on Contemporary Art, and I took this ad apart. I literally blew it up on a stat camera and cut it all apart. Every tool, every little box, every shape of color, spread it out over my desktop and put it back together with my own text. Instead of advertising a tool or a sprocket, it's advertising performance troupe that uses fire or something like that. And then down here I even put a coupon so you could actually, mail in and order things. Not that it worked, but it was just part of the game.
I finally got to meet Art. Like years ago, we were doing a thing in, was it Kansas City or St. Louis? St. Louis. I was like, Art, you're one of my heroes. And he was such a crotchety old bastard. He's like, what the fuck for? It's great.
The actual functionality is during this phase. Could you take that kid and strangle her?
I was in a head shop back in the late 60s, and I was probably 14, 15 years old, and I saw my first psychedelic poster, and it was like, what is that? And I talked him into selling it to me, and it was the Skull and Roses thing. Then I discovered Rick Griffin, and my whole world shifted on its axis. Well, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I went to school, I wanted to dig up lost civilizations and pyramids, and I quickly realized that was not what archaeologists actually did. I ended up with a degree in art totally by accident. I still am doing archaeology. Posters, they're cultural artifacts. If you document, you create history. And probably done, I guesstimate, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 posters over the last 30-something years. I had worked so hard. And it's like when the Seattle scene took off and grunge hit and all that stuff, I thought, oh good, now I can get rich, Now I can make a living. But all of a sudden, when all the vultures came to town and wanted to exploit the scene and hire all the hipsters, they go, well, who's doing all these great graphics? So go talk to Art. And they meet Art and they go, this old dude?
As Art was cranking out poster after poster, something else was happening in Austin, Texas. Something that would forever change how the world saw rock poster memorabilia.
In the 1980s, as rock was going into one of its mild doldrums, an artist named Frank Kozik established himself in Austin, Texas.
Austin in the 1980s was this amazing, fertile paradise for the counterculture. What you had there is you had a massive population of liberal-minded people drawn from a 1,500-mile radius. You had a wonderful, bucolic, full-service small town with a major university, so all the bands came through. It was like a garden of paradise there, and a lot has come from that scene, and I was very, very lucky to have been part of that.
I think Frank did start the resurgence, it was especially with the day glow and kind of satirical, psychedelic type stuff. It just exploded.
I see Kozik as like the 0 point of all of this. I remember seeing photocopied posters that Frank had done for bands, and that was the first person I saw doing posters for the bands that I liked, you know, posters that weren't like sort of hippie 60s posters.
Frank's posters became omnipresent, and people saw them and said, my God, this is really cool, I could do this too. And a whole bunch of people decided they were going to do screen printing.
He was the first one to come along, and to begin with, he broke out of regionalism. He became national. And then on top of that, he pulled images out of popular culture. He used cartoon figures, classic iconographic images from our own culture, and then he reproduced them in 37 brilliant colors.
I remember seeing Kozik's work for the first time and being totally blown away at the fluorescent glory of it all. You know, it definitely kind of had this comics but punk rock vibe.
He would put things on posters that nobody would put. You'd look at it and go, when I first saw Frank's work, I just thought, I gotta get a job. They're paying this guy to do this. This is the greatest job ever.
Like the first screen printed poster I saw that he did was for a Butthole Surfer show with the little kid with the tab of acid on his tongue. And I couldn't believe that like somebody paid money to have that made, because it was like the kind of stuff that a lot of dudes I know would just do for free. But it was a visual language that kids at that time understood, but it was a clean, neat package. It was like his artwork kind of showed me like, you can do exactly what you want to do. Literally, you do whatever you want to do. If people buy it, if people don't buy it, fine. But if people buy it, you know, the possibilities.
Not just a new poster art form, is almost a kind of a new kind of humor finally bursting out from behind the closet. I think my favorite Kozik piece ever was just this innocent blind girl in a little dress holding out her hand with this evil little boy about to hand her this big tarantula that's gonna bite the hand. I mean, that one I loved.
He's got some posters that are so funny. My favorite one is I use two little fluffy squirrels, and they see a little sign that says free nuts. And it's a hole in the fence, and behind it is this giant devil thing, you know, with big spikes, and they're going to be annihilated, you know.
Well, I grew up in Europe with a Spanish mother. My father was an American serviceman. My parents were estranged shortly after my birth, so it was an odd sort of a youth. So I dropped out of school, I ran away from home, got a job in the Air Force, enjoyed it thoroughly. And what the Air Force did for me was it stationed me to Austin, Texas, just in time for this sort of like amazing cultural thing that happened there. And I started doing posters for what later became like really well-known national acts, is that like I would do their little local gig there in Austin.
As Frank started to dominate the rock poster art scene in Austin, he met an artist named Lindsay Kuhn.
So you're gonna run up there and skateboard down it and then jump over all this stuff to get to the roof over there. It's the only way to get to the roof.
That's how you're gonna get to your office.
Yeah, you have to go over that. And if you hit the boxes, you know, those are all like, you know, for film set, it's all empty boxes, so it doesn't hurt that much when you hit them.
Lindsay knew how to do silk screening, and soon he and Frank started their first print shop in Austin.
I learned how to print in my garage in high school. I went to a skate contest in Florida and was skating with these dudes from Gainesville, and we went by their house and they printed me, they took my thrift store shirt and printed a design on the back of it, and I just thought that was the coolest thing. And when I got home, I went to the library, got a book, and you know, in Mississippi there's no art stores that sell silkscreen stuff in the 80s, so I actually talked to an art teacher, and she gave me a catalog to order the stuff out of, and I started printing in my garage with a little heat light and burning the shirts and just learning how to print, just trial and error. I was at a record show and I was wearing a Butthole Surfer shirt that Frank had drawn, and I met Debbie Jacobson from the Lingerie Gallery. She asked me where I got the shirt because it wasn't a legal shirt, and I was working at a slave labor silkscreen shop. And I went back on Monday after the record show and I said, hey, you ever heard of a guy named Kozik? And they're like, oh yeah, he's the dude that does all the Butthole Surfers art. And I'm like, real cool. I was like, yeah, I just got a job printing rock posters and art. And they were all pissed because I had just moved from Alabama like 6 months before that, and all those guys wanted the job.
Lindsay came on and we built this little print shop. It was complete. It had a press, set of racks, it was all set up.
Basically, Wacky Land is what we ended up calling it because I was going crazy dealing with everybody, just kind of managing 7 people who were at shows all night after working.
So we were printing my art stuff, and I printed like my first big silkscreen fluorescent poster. It was a pig face poster. People freaked out. They'd never seen anything like it because it wasn't just like a little zero. It was this fucking huge day-glow poster for a punk show, and people just lost their minds in Austin.
And that's when it really started getting collectible, like 92, 93. I mean, people would go through our dumpster looking for rejects. I'd go out at night, dump stuff into the dumpster, and there'd be people in it. Everyone on the streets would take them off the poles and the record stores, all that stuff.
My great joy at the time, because I really believed in the scene, right? And so it's like, I want to produce these items, and when people saw that poster, they would be like, how can that exist? That was my goal. How can this exist? Who the fuck made this? This is like a $5,000 silkscreen print. Like, who paid for this? Because nobody had any money, the bands didn't have any money. So I thought about it, and I'm like, well, people buy records and they buy t-shirts. Like, why wouldn't they buy a poster? And I made a deal with the bands, like, look, I'll give you a poster that you could never afford to have printed, and you get so many, and then I get to sell so many at this price, and that pays me for printing the poster, and like, I get to eat. And everyone was like, genius idea, let's do it.
Suddenly, Frank's posters were appearing everywhere. His huge, colorful silk screens were going out all over the country, and kids were getting a kick out of his subversive sense of humor. His posters looked like they were done by a huge record label, but they weren't. They were done in a small print shop in Texas by 2 or 3 guys. And, oddly enough, they accurately represented the look and the feel of that era, the 90s.
The poster that a lot of people feel defines modern poster art, the Kozik Pearl Jam Soundgarden thing. The reason that Green Girl is a quintessential rock poster is because the imagery totally fit the vibe of the times, which was erotic, very organic, and then he puts the tattoos on our body, which is more that weird, organic kind of feel. And like if you were going to shows in 1992, you know that's what it was about. It was this very intense thing that music was doing.
I had gone to a paper goods show the previous weekend, and it was like a one sheet for some like 70s porn film, Inga, with a chick, and I'm like, well, that chick looks really good. So I just cut her out, glued it on a piece of cardboard, inked in the tattoos. Literally, it took me like half an hour to do that poster. Now, because it's such a great photo, and it's a little ambiguous, like is she like listening in the crowd, is she having an orgasm? Had tattoos, so it was like, ooh, it's kind of cool counterculture vibe going on. And then, of course, those bands went on to become like super famous. It's a little frustrating. A poster that was a throwaway poster for me becomes like the most famous one. Other posters, I was really into the bands and I had spent like enormous amounts of time, like nobody cares. I guess probably like the first guy that really took off and ran with it was Lindsay.
Lindsay's images were just really odd and creepy, and the people are all mangled. Some like the women are mangled and they have like a hook claw, and like, you know, it's just funny.
Soon Frank and Lindsay met a guy named Coop. Coop was sort of the next generation of lowbrow California artists, and he immediately started doing rock posters after moving to LA from Oklahoma.
For me, you know, being a teenager at the time, it was like Coop and Kozik. I had a Coop poster. It was the first poster that I ever bought myself, and that was kind of my first introduction to it.
When I was still living in Oklahoma, I used to do flyers for like the Flaming Lips. At the time, the Flaming Lips were just some local band. People in Oklahoma didn't really even think very much of them. But see, I thought they were a great band. I've always thought they were a great band. And when I started doing what it is I'm doing, I was really just sort of figuring it out as I went along, as far as figuring out a way to make a living from it. The first 2 years that I was doing posters, I was pulling those screens and mixing colors and cutting the separations and, you know, the whole bit. Those things have my blood, sweat, and tears in them. Part of the reason I had a connection with Frank was we had a lot of the same tastes. I mean, we were definitely into a lot of the same kind of trash culture and, you know, World War II and images from, you know, propaganda. He would have an image on a poster of like Betty Page, and at that time nobody knew who the hell Betty Page was. You know, that stuff wasn't even on the cultural radar at that point. When I looked at his posters, I knew where he was taking stuff from, and we had that in common.
94, we had like 7 or 8 people working underneath Frank, and we were doing my posters, Coop's posters, Frank's posters, and the occasional art print. We made so many posters that year, it was incredible.
I've got to say, one of the things that Frank and I discussed at the time is that, look, we're making a limited edition seriograph that you can buy for $20. And you know, at the time we were selling posters for $20, $25. And now some of those posters are, you know, most of them are worth hundreds of dollars, some of them worth even more. We felt at the time that we were providing a way for somebody who was interested in art and wanted to collect art, a way to do it really inexpensively.
The rock poster revolution was officially on. People around the country started to take note and follow suit. In Detroit, an artist named Mark Arminsky had started doing silk screens around the same time as Frank. And in Cleveland, an artist named Derek Hess started doing his own sketchy style of rock posters.
You know, we went through this whole 70s kind of punk scene where everybody was just doing flyers, but I kind of thought it'd be cool to start doing some color posters again. So I think Kozik was doing right about the same time, from what I understand. But I really wasn't aware of anything that was going on outside of Detroit.
Mark Arminsky in Detroit was doing his own thing, which was nice because the other guys were day glow. Mark Arminsky was doing it in a totally different approach.
We called it marbleized, that's what we named it, but when you silk screen the flood bar, it lays a layer of ink down, then the squeegee comes and pushes it to the screen and prints it. We would take this thing called a dauber that we made, and really it was a toilet paper roll on a big piece of cardboard, and we would paint all this ink over it and hit the screen with it, and it would print this unique pattern. This is kind of what marbling is. See how this is painted? Everyone would be different, and so everyone, the background is different on it. But that's what marbleizing is.
The first time I ever became sort of aware of posters as a thing that there's somebody who's doing this repeatedly and keeps making posters was Derek Hess. Really admired Derek's work, and his drawing style completely blew me away.
He took something like the whole sketchy style and made it his own.
It was such a departure because to me, my first reaction was that they went out of their way to take an etching medium or something else and apply it to silk screening, which I thought was kind of revolutionary.
I had moved back to Cleveland from Detroit, and I immediately started working at the Euclid Tavern, and they complained all the time about how certain nights were not doing well. And I was always complaining about certain bands skipping our market, and eventually they were like, well, you book them here. So I quickly had to learn. But once they found out that Cleveland was willing to do off nights, my voicemail would just fill up. The concert posters that I do I approach them a little different. It's because I was trained in lithography, working on stone lithos, and I didn't have any training in silk screening. My early influences were a lot of comic book artists from the 60s and mid-70s. When they went to art school, they had to learn how to draw the figure if they wanted to move on. The figure is a good way to tell a story because we're all encased in this, and so everybody can relate to a human figure.
At the time, the only real access in this genre worldwide was like the art rock catalog. Like towards the back of the catalog, that would be like this new stuff, you know, and it would be like Mark Arminsky. So that's where I first saw Justin Hampton.
It just seemed like the catalog was everywhere at that point. I mean, it just was like, you know, they published it and it went out everywhere. And I was like, you know, wow, there's someone that's publishing this work. And, you know, at that point, especially being a starving artist, I couldn't afford to print, you know, my own run of hundreds of screen prints, you know. So I contacted them, and the first one was my PJ Harvey poster, which was the big one that kind of got me a lot of exposure. And everyone saw that catalog and the ads and juxtapose, and I had people coming up, it's like, oh, you're a rock star, you got all these, like, you know, exposure in these different places. And I was just like, I'm still starving.
When the art rock catalogs came out, and there were nice little 6x9-inch full color catalogs that they were sending out all across the country. You know, it said Kozik, Coop, Kuhn on it, and it had all our posters in it. I think that's when I figured, okay, this is kind of blowing up right now.
One look was all it took, and everything was said, my darling. One look was all it took, and you were in my head, my darling. I stood like an open book, waiting to be read, my darling. One look was all it took, and you were in my head, my darling. It's something so surreal, the stupid way you make me feel. When everything is said and done, somehow you are still the one. Don't make me wait so long to hesitate. Would be right.
The one thing that really started the modern poster explosion, it actually allowed it to happen and get to the point where it is people realizing that screen printing was this enabling medium.
It wasn't so long ago that commercial silk screen printing was exactly that. Man, with all his synthetics, hasn't been able to improve on good silk, a wondrous material which requires so little and gives so much in return. A piece of contrasting film is taped in place. The penciled guidelines are quickly cut. Whatever your skill or experience, one wipe with the adhering solvent, another with a dry rag. Don't drown it. Don't scrub it. Just stroke it.
I learned how to screen print through a little speedball screen printing kit my grandmother bought me. It's one of the first things we did is me and my buddy bootlegged Metallica shirts for us and our friends. The speedball screen printing kit, compared to what we use now, is pretty funny. The squeegee isn't quite a squeegee. It's almost like something you'll wipe your windows off with. The screens were really loose, but it really taught me kind of what methods were available to me.
Anybody can go out right now to an art supply store, buy a speedball kit, and you can make a one-color screen print on your kitchen table. The screen printing is of vital importance to the current poster scene.
Like any other DIY movement, suddenly you didn't need the help of a big corporation to make something that looked like it came from big money. Many artists were printing work in their own basement. However, when the demands of creating the art and printing it yourself became too much, many turned to diesel fuel prints, who started printing work for Frank, as well as many of the poster artists doing it today. Other print shops like Firehouse in San Francisco sprung up as well.
Ron Donovan and Chuck Sperry, otherwise known as the Knuckleheads.
When I look at like new product and stuff like that, and you look at the manual and it says like, oh, well, you can do this and this and this with it, but you definitely cannot do this, this, and this with it. What's the first thing that I do? I do that.
They're great cats, but they go home to their studio and they just do the work, and the work speaks for itself.
I met Firehouse at the San Francisco Rock Art Revival and talked to them a little bit, and they're like, yeah, you know, anytime you want to come to the shop, hang out and check out the printing process. So I was like, right on, you know, I'm gonna go to Firehouse and see what they do.
This rack, it's so funny, we built it for like $100. And then we rebuilt it October 17th at 1:10 p.m.
So I set up a day when I go down there and meet them, and so I go up the stairs, and I'm like expecting to see like all this insane equipment. I'm like, oh my God, there's gonna be this crazy equipment. I'm gonna be so excited, and all this stuff I've never seen before. And these guys are, you know, international screen print superstars and all that. And I go up there, they're printing press was a freaking door with jiffy hinges screwed to it. And I was like, I'm like, so where do you print your posters? Oh, right here.
Well, look at it right here. This is a table, but it's an
office door.
It's an actual office door.
Yeah, like you print all these amazing posters on this door, an old door. You see, it's got a little hole for the door handle in there. Really, that is when I was like, wow, you know, these guys are great.
Something else happened in 2001 which took the number of poster artists from a few hundred to several thousand. A site called gigposters.com sprung up, and with it emerged rock poster artists from every part of the country imaginable. Posters were now being used not so much for advertising, but more as a fine art collector's item.
I'll tell you, I only thought there were about 20 people or 25 people doing this, and I didn't know, even after seeing gig posters for the first time, that some of these people have been making posters for as long as me and Ron.
When I first started on gig posters, there was maybe a couple hundred people. Man, not even that many, maybe 100 people. Now, go to gig posters and pull up artists, page upon page upon page.
Gig posters for me became a conduit to the artist's own sites. Espresso beans and gig posters were absolutely critical from the standpoint of not only the artists, but also for the people like me that just gotta have the next sweet looking poster, you know?
I just graduated from a technical college. I really wanted to kind of practice my skills, so I wanted to create a website that I enjoyed, and I decided to start gigposters.com, basically with my own collection of posters. I just thought it would be kind of cool to invite other people to join and post their posters up and make it more of a community sort of thing. And I had no idea what it would turn into, but more and more people were telling everyone they knew about it, and it just steamrolled into what it is today.
It's made a lot more people accessible to being able to do posters, to doing any kind of artwork. And there's a club around every corner, so anybody can go to that club if they know somebody, which is what's happening.
I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of guys doing this now, and it's become a career, as opposed to when I was doing it. I saw my career as I was an artist, and I saw doing these posters as one aspect of being an artist.
It's become a huge thing now, and it's like, I mean, I've talked to certain clubs that were like, dude, I get emails like every day requesting to do show posters. I'm just like, wow, that's insane.
It's ushering in a rebirth of American illustration. Since the advent of the computer, illustrators went out of business. Some of the best illustrators I know end up going to things like roofing because they couldn't make a living doing illustration work anymore. And now, because of gig posters and this poster thing, we have an entire new generation of American illustration.
I think I realized that there was definitely a movement with the flat stock events. When those really started taking shape, that's when it really felt like this is a community, this is growing, it's organized.
Well, the first flat stock came about for just two reasons. It was gig posters, which organized everyone, and it was Frank.
Well, it's like I had been hanging out on those gig posters forums for a while, and everybody is like sort of pissing and moaning that like we can't get our stuff in any shows and we can't make any money. And I sort of floated the idea, I'm like, why not have your own show? So like, we did it and a bunch of people came and it seemed to do well. So I think now they're on like their 15th one and each one gets better and works.
Oh, this is my shopping list. I've already made some commitments. So I'm walking through, I'm doing my damage assessment and figure how much I have to defend with my wife, and then...
What's the ballpark of the grand total?
It's about $800.
You stop and go, and I want that one, and I want that one, and I want that one. And then you realize that you've got a sack by an artist that's half an inch thick.
In '95, I was huge into Fish right after I graduated high school. He'd be one of the first people into the show, and he sold out posters. You can't even get one, you know, and you wait in line. That's why I'm like, we're going to be first in line today, and sure enough, like third in line. And I scored like the only Deer Creek Fish piece, so definitely worth it.
There are a lot of people who are very snobbish about what is art. And the reality is that if these important works of art that are only appreciated by the select few are sitting in some room somewhere and people have to look and say, oh, can you tell me what this means? And they don't say anything. What the hell does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. If you've got a poster and people look at it and they relate to it and it changes their life, that's what art's about.
Actually, I brought some vintage 78 posters because 78's the year we got married.
See, like this is one I was searching for. I was helping a friend move. He had a bunch of these that he'd ripped off the wall. I mean, it's all beat up. No collector would want this, but you know, this one's kind of cool. It's got like a BB shot, and then I got Chuck to sign it, and he put darn shooting.
I don't really like the term lowbrow. It's like, I don't know, there's nothing really low about it. It's awesome.
Well, I don't understand what lowbrow art is either. I guess to the general public what it means is you're into things like, you know, hot rods and pinup art and tattooing and what would be considered low culture. But, you know, I just consider that it's pop art. I mean, it's all part of popular culture, and I see what I'm doing as just sort of an extension of that.
How long were you waiting today to get through again?
It's been at least an hour now, at least.
And what are you picking up today? Which one?
I don't know if there'll be anything left by the time I get up there.
I approach my work as if it was fine art. I want to make something cool that's going to be worthy of hanging in a home, even if some of them do get used for their original intended purposes, to be stapled up somewhere, to be taped to the lobby of the venue. If you look at other misunderstood genres of art, I think the measure of success maybe is not that establishment of the industry, but the fan base, the grassroots people. It's going to be the people that grew up with you at that same level that are influenced by your art.
If you take all the artists that have ever existed, right, like a tiny percentage of them had the fortune to live in a period where they were part of something. You know, most artists are toiling in isolation, you know, but just to be a part of something and to, like, you know, I'm fortunate.
I'd hope to think that, like, the work that I'm doing in 20 years is still somehow connected to the underground that it came from. That's what's seemingly most exciting in any generation, is what's coming out from underneath.
Yeah, it's pretty much a losing money deal, or breaking even maybe. I think maybe breaking even, but that's not why I do it. I do it because I love music, and I love the local scene, and I love, you know, punk rock and all that's involved with that.
At every show, kids come up and ask, how'd you start doing this? What do you got to do? It's like, you just got to do it. Go find a book and start doing it and practice. And when you mess up, it looks just as cool.
I know some friends who have different jobs, and they work their jobs and they feel like, I'm going to quit my job because this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. What I'm supposed to be doing is being lead guitarist of a band, or being whatever it is, a painter. And I never feel like I'm missing something that I'm supposed to be doing. I wake up in the morning, and I wake up early, and I can't wait to get to work.
I think the work that I did reflected that sort of rock and roll, you know, underground popular culture, because it reflected my tastes. You know, that was my world, that was my generation or whatever, so in that sense it reflected it. And the fact that my work was and is popular, it was reflecting something. I mean, you know, Robert Williams always used to talk about how the Impressionist painting represented an absinthe-based culture, and the way he related that to what he does and what I do is, he said, you know, that's the thing 100 years from now, is that everybody will look at like our work and say, oh yeah, that was the end of the Second World War and the fall of communism, of just this sort of weird boiling pot of angst and rock and roll. And something else is going to come along, I guess, and I don't even really know what that is.
By this time, I had run out of money. It was time to get back to a paying job and figure out how to get this thing finished. But the trip was something I'll never forget. Here's to a movement that's always been about making imagery inspired by the era that it came from, powered by the people, challenging the status quo, and doing it without anyone's permission or the backing of big money. A notion I guess you could say I can identify with.
No matter how good you are, like nobody cares. Like no one's gonna like come to your house and go, oh, by the way, the world suddenly realized that you're like an amazing artist and like a genius and like a wonderful person, and we're basically gonna fund all your endeavors for the rest of your life, and you don't even have to actually perform. Like that's never gonna happen to anybody. Like no one's ever gonna come to you when you're at home like all depressed and like eating too much and go like, oh, like here's a camera, okay, and a travel budget, and here's an idea for a documentary, and we're gonna give you like all these magazine articles because you're really cool. Like it's not gonna happen, right? You gotta kind of have to do that stuff for yourself, right? It only exists if you yourself create it.
I'm hoping that I can remain connected to what we have in the scene.
And you're not going to always.
No.
And I'm not going to always, but maybe we can become old and grumpy with integrity.
Right.
Ten 9-8-7-6 5 4 3 2 1 0. Blast off. Go.
Go.
Okay, my eyeballs on straight.
My name is Matt Daly. I'm a professional screen printer. And
What's your happiest poster-related moment? I would like to hear that.
Knowing you.
Yeah. Nobody's buying that sap.
Called the agent for Shudder to Think and wanted to ask her if there's, hey, that was Lucy making a cameo.
Cut, put it on the editing floor. Let me stick my finger up my nose.
What were you like as a kid? What kind of things were you into?
Can we just move on?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm like freaking out. All right. I'm twitching. I'm like, I know. I'm like wiggly. Hello. I'm a wiggly worm.
Can I do that more? I think I'm gonna do that some more. That's like the 4th time I've done it.
My advice for any young artist starting out in rock posters, don't do it.
Get a real job. Get something that's gonna pay the bills.
Yeah, no, let's not show that.
And, you know, hopefully bring a fresh vibe to the scene. Fresh vibe. I said fresh vibe.
To me, all of my posters are like the most obvious thing ever. It's like, how can you not look at like, you know, the Flintstones and not think about them like all each other on the sly and cheating with, you know, Betty's off and licking Wilma's when they're at work. You know, how can you not think those things? I think them.
I liked to see the process, the imperfections, and
what?
I'm sorry, I'm so boring.
I'm just tired of your shit.
I wound up doing some artwork for an organization called, it was a volunteer thing, yeah.
Take 2.
The oddest job before I was a poster guy. I worked in a florist for about 4 months.
Building scale models of Payless shoe source stores.
I worked in the school lunchroom in high school. That fucking sucked.
Worst job before being a poster artist. That has to be. That place sucked. It's horrible. And I quit when I swept out a rat head under the. Oh, that was the worst job. That was the worst job ever. No, actually, it was the snapping turtle in the back of somebody's van. Yeah, I was loading somebody's groceries, and the guy was just like, "Watch out, that thing will take your finger off." He was going to go home and he was going to eat it. He ran over it with his car, and it was crushed, but it was still alive. And I was like, "This is it. I'm finished."